Hey everybody, it's Rachel. Sorry it took so long to get this video. I was trying to be techie and, well, just brought me back to pen and paper. So let's go ahead and get started about the sacral diagnosis. We're going to start with the two easiest ones to name, but not necessarily the easiest ones to diagnose, especially in the setting of a practical. So if you come across in a practical that the sacral bases are even, either they're both anterior or they're both posterior, that can be a little frightening because you're expecting them to have some difference in them. However, this is normal. Just say your findings that they both look even, and then move on to the ILAs, and you'll see that those also look even. Again, just verbalize that, and you may be able to tell that the bases are more posterior than the ILAs, but if you can't, that's fine. Then we'll move on to springing. So either you will do the four-pole springing with your index fingers at the bases and your thumbs at the ILAs, or you'll just use your thumbs and for both of them. Either way works fine, whatever one you think you are able to feel the best motion or lack thereof. So for this first one that we'll talk about, at the bases, you'll see that you will have no motion. It'll just feel like you're hitting a brick wall for both of them, and it feels about equal on both. And then you'll go down to the ILAs, and you'll feel like these guys move very freely. It's very easy to spring on them, and so you'll see that has good motion. So then to name it, you want to separate. You want to find your axes first, and so you're going to separate the worst motion or the most posterior from the best motion or the most anterior. So you're going to draw your axes right down the middle. And so since both of them are on the same side, they're both messed up, it is bilateral. And then since the bases are posterior, they're sticking out towards you, they're an extension, so it's a bilateral sacral extension. So then the other sacrum is just kind of the opposite. So your bases are actually going to have your best motion, and then your ILAs are going to have your worst. And they're going to be equal motion on the bases and equal for the ILAs, equally worse. Okay, so then we're going to draw our axes again, separating the best motion, the most anterior, from the worst motion, the most posterior. And then again, we see that it's on both sides, so that has a dysfunction, so it's bilateral. And then the bases are anterior, so they're going to be flexed forward. So it's a bilateral sacral flexion. So something else that might be kind of tricky with this is that everything is going to be equal, which we kind of talked about. The bases, the ILAs are going to be equal in both the anterior posterior aspect and the superior inferior, but you may also have kind of an equal lateralization on both. So it might be tricky deciding which side is worse, and your backwards bending test may not tell you much. They may just stay equal, which can be confusing because there may not be an anterior base. There's not a base to lateralize to. So just something important to remember is that everything is equal. Your diagnosis is mostly just based on your springing and knowing that everything is equal. So I started talking about lateralization. So let's go over that because there's a lot of questions regarding that. So we were first taught the seated flexion test and the ASIS compression test, and you can throw in the standing flexion test as well, but these are the only two on your practical. So these are the ones that you were taught to lateralize the pelvis and the sacrum. One is not better than the other to lateralize for the sacrum or pelvis. They can be used for both body landmarks. And what these do is it tells you whether it is the right or the left side. So this is for pelvis and sacrum. Okay? So then this backwards bending test is also a lateralization, except it tells you anterior or posterior. And it doesn't really care if the anterior is on the left or the right when you're lateralizing. So let's kind of talk a little bit about how you figure this out, because if you can understand how this test works, then it may not be as confusing. It's a little bit less memorization. So see, we have our sacrum here, and I'm just randomly drawing posterior and anterior here. And let's say our person, they extend backwards, and so that automatically means that our sacrum is going to flex forward. However, let's say this posterior side is the one that's stuck. So it's not going to go anywhere. And in neutral position, you're already seeing a difference between the two. The anterior is obviously more anterior, the posterior is more posterior. So when the sacrum goes into flexion, this anterior is going to go even more anterior. It's going to hit the anatomical barrier or the physiological barrier, more likely, of it being able to go anterior, and that's the posterior base is going to stay in that restrictive barrier of that posterior. So it becomes more asymmetrical, which is a positive test. Okay? So now let's look at the opposite. And I'm just going to keep the same sides for just to make it easy. So let's say this side is actually the side that is restricted. And when we do the backwards bending test, the person extends and the sacrum flex forward. In the neutral position, it is already in an anterior position, but it's not in the physiological barrier. It's just in a restrictive anterior barrier. So then this posterior one is able to go more anterior, and then it becomes symmetrical. It just kind of evens out. It reaches kind of that same plane right there, the anterior base. So that is actually a negative test. Okay, so then your lateralization tests of the seated flexion and the ASIS compression, they should work together with this one. So for this sacrum, your ASIS compression test and or your seated flexion test should say that the left side was the problem child. And then your backwards bending was like, yes, I agree, and it's posterior. It is, in fact, restricted posteriorly. And then the same kind of over here, your seated flexion test and or your ASIS compression test should say it is indeed the right side. So left, right side that is restricted, and your backwards bending test is just kind of confirming, yes, it is that side and it is anterior. Okay? All right, so let's move on to the more complicated diagnoses. So again, I'm just going to kind of stick to this posterior anterior side. You can switch it if you want to maybe test yourself, make this grid, and then just switch it and see if you can kind of follow through again with it just being on the opposite side. But it gives you the exact same diagnoses, just rights and lefts are switch. Okay, so this is going to be the difference for our backwards bending test. Okay, it's easy to separate the diagnoses into here. That's why I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to the seated flexion test and the ASIS compression test. I just use it as a confirmatory to the backwards bending, and if I did that right. So if I get something that differs, then I might want to try again or recheck. Okay, so let's say our backwards bending test was positive, so it became more asymmetrical. Okay, so there are 3 different options. So we have posterior, that's the one that we lateralized to on all 3 of these. And all 3 of these, since we lateralized to these, both in the ASI's compression test and the backwards bending test, we know that that guy is the most restricted one out of the sacrum, so it is automatically, it should have the worst motion. There's another kind of confirmation for you. If it's not the worst motion, then maybe you lateralize to the wrong spot, or you're not doing the springing right. Just recheck. But have confidence in yourself so you're not rechecking everything. Okay, anyway, so for these first 2, just based on posterior and anterior, they're going to look exactly the same. So we can differentiate them based on their springing. So springing is super duper important in this. So for this first one, let's say this ILA also has equally as worse motion as the sacral base. And these 2, anterior base and ILA, they can either have great motion or so-so motion. That's what that symbol means, is it may move a little bit, but it's not the best. And they usually have about equal motion, whether it's so-so or perfectly good motion. So again, we're going to separate the worst motion, or the most posterior, from the best motion and the most anterior. And since it's on both the base and the ILA, our axis goes right through the middle. So how you name this is you look, oh, this is all posterior on the left side. So the left posterior. And this is kind of a margin of the sacrum, if you want to think of it that way. So it's a left posterior sacral margin. Okay? So then we'll move on to this next one. So how it differs from this top one is that this ILA that's posterior actually just has so-so motion. It probably is a little restricted, but not as restricted as this posterior base. And this anterior base is also just so-so. But this anterior ILA, it has the best motion. Okay. So again, we're going to draw our axes to kind of separate the 2, which gives us this. So what we do now is that we realize we actually kind of ignore this bottom half. So we use this bottom half to help us understand how to diagnose, how to set up everything, so that now we can just kind of focus on the sacral base, okay? So we're going to kind of look at it as a vertebrae at first. Whenever we are checking the transverse process, we saw that one was posterior and one was anterior, and that usually helped us see which one was rotated. So that's what we're going to do here too, is that we're going to see that this posterior one is kind of showing us that it is rotated to the left. Okay? And then we also keep looking at the base, just kind of ignore the ILAs for naming this, and we see that the axis is on the right side. Okay, so it's rotated left on a right oblique axis. Okay, so that's how we name it. It's posterior on the left, so that means it's rotated to the left, and the axis is on the right, and so that is how it is rotating on that axis. Okay, so now we'll move on to this last one, which is a little bit easier. So it's actually going to be set up more like this. And this anterior ILA is going to have the best motion. And this anterior base is going to have so-so motion, maybe a little bit, but not as good as this ILA. And this posterior is also going to have so-so motion, maybe a little less motion, but not as little as this base. So again, we're going to draw our axis so that it separates the worst motion from the best motion. And look, now we have something very similar to what you've already seen. Okay, the only difference is that it's on one side. So we just kind of ignore this side. It's no longer really important to us. And we're going to say that is a unilateral. It's on one side. And since the posterior side, or it's posterior on the sacral base, that is going to be extended back. So it's a unilateral sacral extension. Okay, so those are the three diagnoses with a lateralization to the posterior side. Okay, so now we did the backwards bending test, and it was actually negative. So it got more symmetrical. And for this case, we lateralized with the seed flexion test and or the ASIS compression test, and we lateralized to the right side. Okay, there's only two options here. This one doesn't exist for the anterior side. I don't really know why. Maybe it's due to treatment. It's easier to treat a posterior, or maybe it just has never been found to be significant on the anterior side. So I don't know, but it's one less thing for you to memorize, so I guess that's a good thing. So we'll start with this top one and see it looks like this. Well, that looks awful lot like both of these. And so we're going to differentiate again with springing. And that's kind of the key with all of this. So like I said before, the posterior one, the one that we lateralize to, this anterior one, is always going to have the best motion. And then, excuse me, so for this first one, this anterior ILA is actually going to have so-so motion, maybe a little, but again, not as good as this one. This posterior base is also going to have so-so motion. And this posterior ILA is going to have the worst motion. And so then we're going to draw our axis again. It goes that way, separating the good from the bad. And we're going to kind of ignore this bottom half again, like we did with the other oblique. So let's look at this. It's set up the exact same way. So this is the posterior side, this is the anterior side. So if we're looking at it as like a transverse process, again, it is rotated to the left, okay? So the only difference now with this guy is that the axis is actually on the left side. So there's a rotated on a left oblique axis. Okay, so the sacral base is rotated, and then it rotates actually along this axis, but we name it for the base side, where that axis is on the base, the sacrum. Okay, so now we'll move on to this bottom one, and it's going to be set up like this. So this posterior base, so-so motion, anterior base, so-so motion, or sorry, anterior ILA. This posterior ILA is going to have the worst motion. Again, draw our axes separating the good from the bad. And then it's just like this other one that you've already seen also. However, it's just on one side. So we're going to kind of ignore this side and say it's unilateral. And because the sacral base is anterior, it's in flexion. So it's a unilateral sacral flexion. Okay, so there's all of those more complicated diagnoses. So just focus, once you get the posterior and anterior. Don't forget to check superior and inferior. It's not as significant for naming, but it is a good diagnostic tool. I won't cover that just so that it's less confusing at this stage. But make sure you do it on your practical. Anyway, for figuring out your name of the diagnosis, just focus on posterior and anterior at the base and the ILA, and then check the springing. And then use your lateralization tests to figure out which side is the worst. That way you can either say if it's on this side or this side. Okay? All right, so now let's talk about torsion. So torsion is concerning the L5. And if you say that it has a there's a torsion with the sacrum, it means that the L5 has been compensated on the sacrum. Now, I only drew 2 different diagnoses of the sacrum because these are really the only 2 that can have either a compensated or uncompensated L5. For the posterior sacral margins, the unilateral sacral extensions, the or flexions, and the bilateral sacral flexions or extensions, those don't have a compensated or uncompensated L5. It is not applicable at all. So when you do your diagnoses and you get one of those that wouldn't have an applicable L5, still go ahead and check L5, but then just say that it is not applicable. Okay, so now to understand whether you have a torsion or not, if you have one of these oblique axes, this is a rotated left sacrum on a right axis. We already kind of talked about that. This is our lovely drawing of an L5. So in order for it to compensate, think about if you are kind of falling while you're rotated to the left, you're going to compensate by rotating the other way to kind of keep you from falling. So that's kind of the idea, is L5 is just trying to balance us against what the sacrum is doing. So while the sacrum is rotating to the left, L5 is going to rotate to the right. Okay, so this transverse process should be posterior. And then in addition to that, it should also side bend towards the axis. So we say that the axis is on the right, so it should side bend right. Okay, here's our axis. It's going to side bend towards, it's going to try and touch that axis. Okay, so our L5 diagnosis should be rotated right, side bent right. Now, if you remember, our type 2 mechanics is that they rotate and side bend the exact same way. So now you also have to figure out if it is flexed or if it is extended. It doesn't really have a preference for the compensated. The rotation and side bending is what matters to decide if it is compensated or not. So now let's go over to this side. So here's our L5 again. So we have another rotated left, except this time the axis is on the left. Okay, so our sacrum is rotated this way. So our L5 to be compensated is going to rotate this way. Sacrum's rotated to the left, L5 is rotated to the right, just like what we saw on the other side. However, since the axis is over here, it is going to side bend to the left. Okay, it's trying to touch the axis that is coming up on the left sacral base. So L5 is going to be rotated right, side bent left. This is type 1 mechanics. Okay, so that means it has to be neutral. You can check, you should check flexion and extension as well. There might be a slight preference, but if it's not major, then you know it's in neutral and that it is indeed a type 1. okay? So that's compensated. If it is uncompensated, the best way to know that is if your sacrum is rotated to the left, then L5 is also going to rotate to the left. It really doesn't matter as much as to which way it's side bent, or if it's a type 1 or type 2. Just know that it cannot be compensated if it's rotated the exact same way as the sacrum. Okay, so once you see that, you know it's uncompensated. That just simplify it in that to that degree. Okay, it's the exact same thing on this side. Since it is rotated to the left, our L5 is going to rotate to the left. It's the exact same for both of those. Just look at the rotation. Okay, so I hope that helps. Here's a last look at the torsions and the uncompensated L5. Here's a last look at all of the sacral diagnoses along with your bilateral ones. And here's a last look with the lateralization stuff. I hope that helps. Good luck. If you guys have any questions, just email us. We'll be around. All right. Have fun.